Are you interested in learning more about what it means to be a man, the good, the bad, and the toxic? Welcome to the So Manly podcast, where we aim to learn about topics that help us understand all of these things. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the So Manly podcast. I want to be learning as we go with this. So when I talk to people here, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from a place where I don't have all of the answers or have all of the language as well. And I'm so grateful to people who come on here and talk with me about these kinds of topics. So today I want to introduce Frédérique Chabot, who is the Director of Health Promotion at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, and is responsible for the development of information products and resources, including public awareness tools, identifying research policy development, and engagement opportunities in the domestic context. So I just want to welcome you, Fred. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hi, I'm excited to join you for this conversation.
And now I gave a pretty lengthy title there with some of the language from your organization's website, but could you give me maybe just a bit of an idea of the work that you do on a day in, day out kind of basis? So some of the practical pieces that come along with your role.
Sure. So Action Canada is the amalgamation of three organizations that some people might know about. So one of them was Planned Parenthood Canada some time ago, although that name is not used anymore. And we've joined forces with global advocacy organizations that do work at the UN level to combine our forces to work on sexual health and rights issues broadly. So personally, I'm on the domestic team, so the health promotion team that works on national issues. And so day in, day out, what I do is mostly research and writing of content that supports both our engagement with the public, so they have access to accurate, sex-positive health information, and then also support the work of our campaigns team that works with government officials across Canada, so at the federal level and provincial and territorial level, to achieve policy and law reform when it comes to sexual rights.
I was looking through your website, looking at some of that stuff, and I wonder what are some of the things that, being a parent, can understand some of the things around sex-positive parenting. You also have on there a lot of a for all ages approach, which I found was really awesome to provide resources for people throughout their life. And then also the idea, I just wasn't sure exactly what sexual rights entitled, like what some of the maybe these specific topics that would be covered under something like sexual rights. Is it like abortion access? Some of the things that would come up under that topic.
Right. So that's a great question. I think a lot of people wonder about the difference, why we say sexual health and rights. In my own personal career, if I may call it that, I've worked in several spaces where the focus was health. So I've worked at an AIDS service organization here in Ottawa. I've worked with sex workers in Ottawa nationally. And then at Action Canada, we also work directly with people who are looking to access abortion, as that's one example. And it became really obvious to me that health cannot happen without access to our human rights. So there are specific rights that protect our health. So access to information, we have a right to health. So that may play out differently for someone who's trans, who can't access affirming healthcare, for example. So there's a rights issues. Same with right to privacy, right to freedom, right to so there's a series of human rights that are specifically tied to our sexuality and gender, and reproduction that are captured under the name sexual rights. So at Action Canada, we basically try to further our agenda in terms of rights to make sure that people can be healthy and thrive as it relates to their sexuality or gender.
And you did mention, I think a lot of the work you've done previously is around sex work. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was incredibly fortunate that when I came here to Ottawa, so I moved here in 2007. I met incredible people who were working already in forming an advocacy group here in the city. It so happened that one of them was my roommate. So I was exposed early to the work of incredible activists here who were sex workers themselves and who were organizing to assert their rights in a city that was incredibly hostile politically to sex workers. And so I was enlisted early. At the time, I was a master's student at Carleton University here in Ottawa. And I ended up working with them to do research and content development for advocacy tools. And I ended up embarking in this journey, this odyssey for the next 10 years. So I just left the board of that local organization called POWER. So Prostitutes of Ottawa Work, Educate, and Resist. So for 10 years, I worked with sex workers and their close allies to do both local and national advocacy around sex work rights.
One of the things you just mentioned, like when I was trying to learn more about sex work and the importance of decriminalization and labor rights, one of the things that I was trying to identify was maybe things that I could see as stereotypes in myself and the people around me that I wanted to identify before trying to learn more. And when you just mentioned about your roommate, I mean, do you think that there is this just general lack of people understanding who sex workers are? Like, is there a vision of who sex workers are that is brought to us through television and movies that is so greatly exaggerated from reality?
Absolutely. This is so I've over the years have done many exercises with students and with healthcare providers and social service providers around misconceptions in terms of who sex workers are, exactly your question. And so one of the questions I ask often to start our conversation is if I say sex workers, who comes to mind? Like, what is the picture you have in your mind? And I'm going to cut directly to the answer because I think many people could guess what it is. So usually it's a woman that we see. It's a woman who is very poor. She's working on the street. She's probably using drugs, maybe addicted to drugs, doesn't have a family, doesn't have people who love her or care about her, and is generally kind of out of control. So I think we could continue to go on and dig around what some of the stereotypes are around who this caricature is. But then, of course, we can also instead move on to talk about what does sex work mean. So sex work, to counter that stereotype, I usually start by saying sex work is an occupational category. So there's no stereotypical sex worker in reality.
Right.
It's like saying educator. Like an educator can be many things. It can be a sexual health educator. It can be a university professor. It can be a kindergarten teacher. Like there are several ways in which educators may manifest as a category of employment. And it's the same thing for sex work. So one of the things that people are most surprised about is when we talk about the numbers we know around how the industry is kind of broken down in Canada. a lot of people assume if I say, what do you think is the proportion of people working on the street when we're talking about sex work? And usually the guess is quite high in terms of percentage. And while it's really difficult to actually account for every sex workers in Canada because it's a criminalized occupation, we do have some numbers, and the estimations are coming from several reputable studies, and it's around, the breakdown is around 5 to 20% of the industry is on the street, probably closer to 5 at this point, with first of all, a lot of policing, and also the arrival in the 90s and early 2000s of cell phones and internet and more easy usage of those. I mean, cell phones arrived before 2000, but an easier access to them, which has, of course, shaped how people conduct their work. And so in a city of Ottawa, we could estimate that people who work on the street are closer to 5% of sex workers who work and live in our city. So that's usually quite surprising to people because that's not what we imagine when we talk about sex workers. And then within that, you have all sorts of variations when it comes to privilege and resources and access to resources. And that, of course, impacts how people do their work. Are they able to rent workspace, sharing workspace, have employees to help them kind of manage the more administrative side of their work? Are they working in a massage parlor? Are they working at home? Are they working out of hotels? Like are they cam people working on camera? Are they working, there's so many possibilities. So it kind of makes it really hard to pin down what would be a sex worker. It's so very diverse. And so what we work with in our societies is exactly that. It's stereotypes that are propelled by movies, video games, and the media, and just common discourse around what sex work is. And that's informed by our attitudes toward both sex and sex work.
And I think that was what I was thinking as you were saying that too, is, I mean, sex is something a lot of people enjoy. It's not a universally loved experience, but it is something that many people enjoy. So are these stigmatizations of sex work some of the reasons why it is so difficult, or why it's been so much work to try and decriminalize sex work?
Well, you're right to say that for many of us, sex can be a very enjoyable experience, but that doesn't actually trump the fact that we live in a very sex negative society. Our culture is very sex negative. And by that, I mean that even though we might not think that we think that way, or we might not be religious ourselves, our culture is shaped by very negative ideas of what sex and bodies are. And so we have crafted these categories to kind of make it okay, or to police kind of the norms around sexuality. And so it creates a hierarchy of what is considered to be appropriate in terms of sexual expression, because it's such a bad thing, a taboo thing, like a thing to fear or be ashamed of. And again, I'm not saying that we might think that consciously, but we are raised in a society that tells us these messages over and over again as we grow up in subtle ways, like continually. So that creates a hierarchy of what sex is okay. So the best kind of, or like the top of the chain, the food chain in terms of sexual expression, is heterosexual, monogamous, married sex between cisgender partners. So that's the kind of sex that we have the least to say about. And then you can go down the ladder to the least sanctioned kind of version of sexual expression. So that means that, queer relationships or gay sex is considered differently. Same with non-monogamous sexual expression, so people who have more than one partner. An example I often give when I want to bring to light how we sex negative we are and how we judge other people's sexual expression is like, the example I give is like, imagine you meet a new partner and, you know, you're just getting to know each other and you're asking, you know, you just end up on the topic of like, okay, well, how many sexual partner have you had in the past? Which, you know, maybe it wouldn't be asked bluntly, but let's say for this exercise, let's pretend it would be. And if this person was like, oh, you know, 3, and every time it was with someone I was in a loving relationship with, then we consider that to be, you know, a note of good character. If the person was like, oh, I've had 120 and it was really fun, I've had a lot of fun, then suddenly, you know, like most of us would feel some feelings around that. And really, that's where we can kind of unearth some of our values and judgments around sexuality. Like, why is having had more sex devaluing people? So what if we, let's say, existed in a culture where we said, oh, I've had 120 partners, and that means that I know what I like and I know how to be in a sexual relationship, like very much. Like I have really developed my skills around consent negotiation and around like pleasure and around like, what if we lived in a culture where that was a good thing?
Sure.
So it's really, again, to kind of surface how we have created a structure in which we judge sexual expression. And then sex work finds itself at the very bottom of it, because in the current hierarchies of sexuality, because it's completely outside of what we have decided was appropriate for sexual expression, especially for women. So, of course, that, you know, informs how people feel around sex work, that this is something that no one would want to do, that this is something that devalues you, etc. So it's really linked to our attitudes around sexuality and not really anything else around like labor.
Does that make the job of sex workers much more dangerous and put them at greater risk of sexual violence?
Oh, absolutely. 1000%. We have created a world where sex workers are put in harm's way deliberately. So it's not sex work that's inherently dangerous, because really, if we think about two scenarios, so let's say I go out to a bar tonight and I pick up a dude to bring, and I decide to go back home with him. I don't know who he is. I don't know if, you know, I don't know where he lives. I don't know if, you know, what could happen in his apartment. And we do consider that risky, but not in the same way as we inherently consider sex work to be risky, when in fact, sex workers are experts in setting up security measures around sexual encounters. So even though they are experts at setting up security measures around sexual encounters, we have made it extremely difficult for them to implement them. So because of our attitudes around sex work and the stigma that sex workers experience in society, we have created laws and criminal laws that are at face value sometimes perceived to be there to protect sex workers, but in fact have made it possible for them to face a lot of violence. And that, so how does that work? So first of all, the way we consider sex workers and the stigma around sex work means that we consider them unrapeable. So that means that when we consider that sex workers are not really in charge of their ability to consent, like no one would want to do this, they must be desperate, or if you say, if you sell your sexual services, that means that you're fair game, basically like you've asked for it. Like rape myths abound when it comes to sex workers, except that we don't offer them any kind of protection in terms of like, well, you put yourself in that situation and you sell your sexual services. So you are therefore like basically putting yourself in harm's way, instead of considering that people, like money or not, you should be able to consent to sexual activity. So when you don't consent, then it's a sexual assault. And so an example of that is even around like this unrapeable kind of myth that exists around sex workers that come from stigma, can even be enacted by police. So police are put in charge of using the law to police society, and they certainly target sex workers quite a bit. And in Ottawa here, we know that from many interviews with sex workers, that one of the strategies to get them to basically to entrap them to kind of negotiate sexual services with an undercover sexual police officer, because that's one way that they can prove that the person was trying to conduct business, is that the police officer will put their hands on a sex worker's breasts or genitals, or force sex workers to touch them to kind of prove that they're a client, so they can actually start negotiating the sexual services, and then to arrest them. And that's considered to be a completely legit police tactic. So that, again, kind of proves that we don't even consider the bounds of consent, like in the same way when it comes to sex workers. And then we have also created laws that basically makes it impossible for people to work safely under the guise of protecting them. But really what it has done is that it has made it impossible to have security personnel, or to screen clients, or to talk with the clients before getting into a car, or to meet with them, or like literally anything that you could do to keep yourself safe is criminalized in Canada.
Thinking of some of the online discourse that you see on Facebook that happens all the time with the, take the last thing you ate and your street name, and this is your porn star name and everything. Does this kind of trivialization of sex work enhance this kind of, attitude that goes around sex work? Like, is this something that we should be calling out when we see it, like speaking up about when we see these kind of posts go up? Because it's something that I've seen frequently enough that people take on as this, jokey thing, but then they will do this joke thing and also have no interest in discussing sex work beyond this joke, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we change? Is that something that we should be looking to push back on, basically?
Totally, because sex workers are so titillating, and strippers are so titillating. Like, people love to talk about them because there's like the aura of sex, and there's also, the societal kind of contempt that exists that kind of raises the bar for like how exciting it is to talk about them, but there's no real conversation about the impact of how we make sex workers to be these caricatures that are under protected but over policed, and how we contribute to that. So like, even when I think about representation of sex workers on, both social medias, but also more traditional media like TV shows or video games. Like, if you think about video games like Grand Theft Auto, I think a lot of people are familiar with that. No one thinks much about the fact that one of the features of the game is that you can interact with sex workers in the game and then have sex with them and then kill them to get your money back. And this is mm-hmm. like literally a fun thing to do. So we create what is called a discourse of disposal, where violence against a certain segment of the population is seen as very normal and expected. Like, it's funny, it's a joke, like we can make fun of them. And even the jokey memes around like, find your porn star name, it's on the same continuum of contempt and trivialization of people and their identity and who they are. And that's kind of macabre when you think of the fact that,
Sure.
those are people who at the end of the day are truly put in harm's way, are truly targeted by predators, because they know that no one will come to bat for them. So, and that was proven in a really interesting study that was done in BC, where prof at UBC, Simon Fraser, started to track how we talked about sex workers in the newspaper. So around the 80s, which changed then because of the kind of gentrification started of downtowns everywhere. So in Vancouver and Toronto and Ottawa, like everywhere, downtown neighborhoods which traditionally had been working class neighborhoods, where sex work was kind of accepted because it was a working class neighborhood. So there was maybe more visibility around sex workers and more like tranquil kind of acceptance. Anyways, during the gentrification push, suddenly there was a concerted effort to push out people who were on the street, including sex workers. And so the newspapers started to talk about cleaning the streets and street sweeps and getting rid of neighborhood cancers. And so this researcher started to track this language and to try to tie it with rates of violence, including homicides. And the correlation was strong. So when that language started to be more visible in the media, then perpetrators basically are given a free pass. Like the levels of violence went up like an arrow shot in the sky. And so it's not benign the way we talk about people. It's not benign the way we, that in a TV show like, Criminal Minds or any crime show, if you compare how characters are treated, like if you have this like white blonde mom from Texas being attacked, in Criminal Minds, the whole premise is that there's this team that comes from Washington to kind of solve murders. And for characters who are deemed valuable, it takes one murder and we'll know the name of the character and she'll have a story and she'll have, it's still pretty gruesome and objectifying, but still like there's a lot of substance and a lot of sympathy is created for that character. And compare that with episodes where sex workers are targeted and you'll have like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 victims before the team comes and no one will have a name and backstory, and it will kind of be implied that it was a little bit their fault. And we've seen that how, serial killers across the Americas have targeted sex workers, not because sex work is inherently more dangerous as labor, it's just because they know no one will say anything.
The term that you use, the discourse of disposal, is so such an eye-opener for me. I mean, as soon as you said it, it was, I start thinking about movies like The Hangover and movies where, again, the violence perpetuated against sex workers is used as like a plot device, like as a move something forward. We know people aren't going to spend too much time thinking about this. So what we can do is set this up as some kind of hilarious scenario for the people in this movie, knowing that it's not going to get them to think anymore about violence against sex workers, but we can use it as a great plot device for how they're in a predicament.
Absolutely. Now. And that's such a good example. And the fact is, I think I know from my gut and from experience, but also from research, that these depictions have real life implications. So yes, to circle back to your question, even like very innocuous looking memes are on that continuum of depersonalizing or trivializing like a category of people who are already marginalized and stigmatized. So we're punching down, like we're literally punching down instead of elevating people who are marginalized in our communities.
And just one other topic that I wanted to touch on a little bit is, again, when we talk about sex work, you had gone into a lot of the different ways that people can be sex workers. And the one thing that I was wondering, again, I mean, there is so much free porn available on the internet, obviously. But the idea that porn is not bad, should you be paying for your porn, looking for ethical consent-based porn? So I was watching a video yesterday that did go through a bunch of sites that were, again, providing like very upfront payment details, allowing the performers to kind of set the tone, set consent for all of their scenes. And this isn't the same kind of thing that's translated into the porn hubs of the world where people want to go online and, access porn easily. So it's another thing where people seem to prefer the simplicity, and obviously not wanting to use their own money to help provide a better environment for performers. So I was just wondering if there was any general thoughts on porn and how to support performers better, maybe?
Yeah, well, porn is just like sex work, is a very interesting thing to kind of unpack. I'm not an expert, but my thoughts on that, colored by what I have, the work that I've done around sex work advocacy. So sex work and porn are not outside of the mainstream culture. So when we zero in on porn in terms of like, oh, it's super misogynistic and racist and all of that, it's true. And I really despise how prevalent that is in porn, but that's not really different from anything else. Both sex work and the conditions of work and what is produced is, informed by our culture and our world and our values. So I would love for people to have a critical lens when looking at the porn that they consume, to be like, how does that further scripts around male pleasure being more important than female pleasure? Because a lot of the mainstream porn is really, most of it is centered on male pleasure only, and is misogynistic when you look at the plots, and and same for like racism in the porn industry and etc. That said, I also want to say, just like in sex work, where I feel incredibly grateful of who I've met doing this advocacy work. Sex workers are badass, and porn actors are badass, and they've organized themselves to do some of the most rad organizing and work for justice or for labor rights or for health, that like it's some of the best movements in the world, in my opinion. Sex workers were at the forefront of LGBTQ rights, like liberation, and like the riots in that started, the gay rights movement were led by sex workers of color, like trans sex workers of color. And it's the same thing in the porn industry. So there's this dichotomy. So there's a lot of shitty porn out there, and that's kind of what's the most available. And there's a lot to say about like the impacts this can have. But also on the other hand, porn laborers are actually like a lot of them, and a lot of the organizers in that world are doing incredible work to protect their labor rights, to ensure they can stay healthy. They're consent specialists. So at the end of the day, yeah, of course, it would be better if ethical porn and ethical storylines and labor rights were prevalent across the board. And I wish that that's what was available easily, because, free porn is great. And it's great that it's easily available. I wish it was better porn that was that easily available. We're not there yet. It kind of follows just mainstream society. Like, like what is truly liberating and justice focused is often more difficult to find than mainstream you know, like status quo type of stories. So yeah, I would invite people to not conflate the two, that porn should be criticized in terms of what is easily available and how it furthers, you know, misogynistic tropes and racist tropes and all of that, but also that it's not cast on porn laborers and porn workers, and that these people are actually doing incredibly cool things for themselves and for others. Same with sex workers. Like, so look it up. Like, there's really cool movements, and maybe I'm more familiar with San Francisco-based like porn stars who organize themselves to protect themselves in the industry, and they've done incredible work. So both are true at once.
With that, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. It has for me been certainly a great education and a great opportunity to learn more about something that, I mean, like you mentioned, people are all, this is mainstream discussions. Everyone is aware of sex work. And then maybe just to have been able to identify in myself what I can maybe change. Again, even just being more aware of how sex workers are being used in movies, or how the discourse that we have with our friends, again, kind of plays into not just that joke for that 1 minute, but how it continues this discourse moving forward. So I want to really thank you for coming in and chatting about this.
I'm so glad we could have this conversation. And if I may recap some recommendations moving forward, because of course this is just a snippet of what a big conversation around sex work could be, because we could continue talking for hours and hours about this, but what can be easily done. I think just like anything, once you start seeing an issue, you will see it everywhere. So you will see how sex workers are talked about in the media. And I invite everyone to pay attention to the words used, even though there's been so much work to encourage newspapers to change their practices, like not just call people hookers or not name people, and to be mindful, but look at how sex workers are depicted in the media compared to other people. Challenge the stereotypes you hold around sex workers. And just like any kind of work done around misogyny and sexism, interrupt your friends' jokes and speak up. And, you know, like there's a lot of small things we can do to stop this, this discourse of disposal, or interrupt like the myths and the really damaging discourse that we have around sex work and sex workers, because we're talking about real people here with, you know, that are all around us. Like there are neighbors. We're talking about, you know, mothers and sisters and neighbors and friends and men too, like around us, who we interact with every day and we might not know that we're talking to. So keep looking at resources too online to further knowledge around who are sex workers and how they're organizing themselves, because it's really badass. It's worth looking.
With that, I really want to say thank you. It's been a great eye-opening discussion for me. And then with these tips, hopefully people listening are able to go forward and make some, again, those are really simple, practical changes you can make. The disrupting the pattern of these jokes, it's something that I've talked about in the past with misogynist jokes or homophobic jokes that people have been socialized to think are acceptable at a round table. And it does take people calling that out for that to stop. If it doesn't stop and you just sit there thinking, well, I'm not going to laugh because it's not funny, that joke will be told again, and it will be told again and again and again. So this simple act of saying thing as simple as, this is not funny, this is not a topic for joking, is something that I know a lot of men, certainly in my life, and those around me need to get better at. So I thank you for not only talking about it, but giving us maybe some practical tips we can take with us and start using immediately.
Well, I'm really glad you decided to take on this topic on your podcast, and I hope everyone who will listen will be glad as well.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I will talk to you again later.